In this lesson, we're going to talk about storage cables that are used for data transfer. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is actually the last one we talked about in our video cables lesson, and that's Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt comes in 4 different versions. Versions 1 and 2 use a DisplayPort type of connector, whereas versions 3 and 4 both use a USB-C type of connector. Now, if you remember in Thunderbolt 3, USB-C could plug into a Thunderbolt 3 port and be used just fine, but Thunderbolt couldn't be plugged into a USB-C port. Well, with version 4, we have both USB 4 using a Type-C connector and Thunderbolt 4 being fully compatible with each other. So you can plug them into either port and they'll work just fine if you're using USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4. When you're using Thunderbolt 4, you can support speeds of up to 40 gigabits per second for data transfer over those cables, but again, those cables are fairly short at under 2 feet, usually at around half a meter. The next type of data transfer or storage cable we want to cover is what's known as the Lightning cable. Now, if you use an iPhone or an older iPad, you have probably used a Lightning cable before. And a Lightning cable is a specific proprietary connector that was created by Apple for use with their mobile devices. A Lightning connector, like USB-C, is fully reversible, so you can put it in either upwards or downwards and it will still fit into the port. The Lightning cable is proprietary to Apple, which means you'll only find it on Apple devices and you will not see it anywhere else. On one end of the cable, you'll find that Lightning connector. On the other, you'll find either a USB-C or USB Type-A connector that can plug into a desktop or laptop so you can sync data to and from your mobile Apple devices back to that laptop or desktop computer. The next type of storage cable we're going to talk about is known as a SATA cable. A SATA cable is spelled SATA, and it stands for the Serial Advanced Technology Attachment Interface. These SATA cables are going to be the standard method of connecting a storage device to your motherboard inside of a desktop computer. So, if you have an internal hard drive, it's likely using a SATA cable. Now, if you're connecting yourself to an optical drive like a DVD or a CD player in your computer, that also will likely use a SATA cable in most modern computers. Now, when we talk about a SATA cable, it's actually not just one cable though. There's actually 2 different cables. Unlike USB and Thunderbolt, where we can provide power to our devices over a single cable, SATA can't do that. So, SATA has 2 cables. One is known as a 7-pin data cable, and this does not supply any power. And instead, we rely on a 15-pin SATA power connector to provide the power to that device. So the data cable does the data transfer, and the power cable is going to provide all the power to that device. Now, SATA data cables come in 3 varieties, but they all use the exact same type of connector, which is an L-shaped 7-pin connector. These cables come in version 1, 2, or 3, which are designated as SATA Revision 1, SATA Revision 2, and SATA Revision 3. With SATA Revision 1, you could support speeds of up to 1500 megabits per second or 1.5 gigabits per second. With SATA Revision 2, you could support speeds of up to 3000 megabits per second or 3 gigabits per second. And with SATA Revision 3, you can support speeds of up to 6000 megabits per second, which is 6 gigabits per second. So what you're going to find in the field is that if you're using SATA Revision 3, your limitation is not going to be the SATA cable itself, but usually the device you're connected to. For example, if you're using a modern hard drive of 7200 RPMs, they simply can't spin fast enough to transfer data at 6 gigabits per second like the SATA data cable can. So keep that in mind when you're building your own PCs, that your big limitation here is probably going to be the mechanical workings of your hard drive itself and not the data cable. Now, in addition to SATA, you may also hear the term eSATA. This stands for external SATA. Now, external SATA is simply using the same type of cable, but on the outside of your case. Originally, SATA was developed just as an internal connection, so you'd use it for things like your hard drives that are inside the case of your tower. But they found that because of these high SATA speeds, it was actually pretty beneficial to allow this to be plugged in on the outside of the case as well, so you could use it for an external hard drive. Now, eSATA really came onto the scene in the days when USB 2 was around with a maximum speed of about 480 megabits per second when you're connecting an external storage device. So, using eSATA with revision 2 at 3 gigabits per second or revision 3 with 6 gigabits per second was extremely fast and very usable. But with USB 3 and USB 4 speeds now getting into 10, 20, and 40 gigabits per second, using eSATA is becoming a lot less common. Now, before we had SATA, we had an older technology that we used to connect our hard drives and CD players, and this was known as IDE or PATA. Now, IDE stands for Integrated Drive Electronics Interface, and this was the interface I grew up with when I started working on computers back in the 90s and early 2000s. But then SATA kind of took over. Now, over time, once the introduction of SATA occurred, people started renaming IDE to what is known as PATA. Now, PATA is actually the Parallel Advanced Technology Attachment, and this is basically renaming the old IDE connectors using the exact same cables and connectors and standards, but calling it something different so that it could be differentiated a lot easier from SATA. So we went from having IDE and SATA to having PATA and SATA. That said, when you're looking at an IDE or PATA connector, you're going to be looking at a gray type of flat ribbon cable. And these IDE or PATA cables would actually have 40 pins on them that would connect to your motherboard. If you're looking at most modern motherboards, you're not even going to see an IDE or PATA connector on them anymore. But if you do, you could still use these with some legacy devices. When it comes to IDE or PATA, these actually were known as parallel devices because you could put more than one device on a single cable. Each cable could support up to two devices and they could both communicate at the same time, which is why we call it parallel. When you look at SATA devices, on the other hand, there is a single cable going from the motherboard directly to that device, which gives you those higher speeds, but it is a limitation of only one device per cable, which is why we call it serial because things have to happen one at a time or in a serial manner. Now, similar to a SATA drive, your IDE and PATA drives did need two different cables to work. One was this flat 40-pin IDE PATA ribbon cable that I just talked about, and that was for the data transfer. But the other was actually known as a Molex power connector. Now, a Molex power connector would be a simple 4-pin connector that would attach from the power supply directly to the device that you were trying to power, such as an internal hard drive or a CD-ROM. Most power supplies today will still provide you with at least one Molex connector as a way to provide legacy or backup configurations if you're using one of these older devices in a modern system. Now, for the sake of completeness, we are going to cover one more older storage technology that we refer to as a legacy technology. This is known as the Small Computer Systems Interface, which is pronounced SCSI, SCSI. Now, SCSI is an example of a legacy parallel bus connector that actually allowed multiple devices to be daisy chained together, similar to the way that you can use multiple devices on a USB chain and be able to daisy chain up to 127 devices over USB. With SCSI, you could either do narrow SCSI or wide SCSI. With narrow SCSI, you could support only up to 7 devices. But with wide SCSI, you could support up to 15 devices. Now again, this is considered a legacy technology and it does operate extremely slowly in comparison to modern SATA connections, and therefore you're not going to run into SCSI used in wide practice when you're out in the field. Now, the big exception to this is if you're working for an older company that has a lot of legacy hardware. Most older servers and data centers were built using SCSI, and if you're still using any technology from 2010 or before, those systems likely are using SCSI for their data connections. When connecting a SCSI device, there was two different types of cables used. There was a high-density cable that used 68 pins to be able to carry data, and with that, you'd have to use a Molex connector to provide additional power to that device. On the other hand, there was also an SCA, or a single connector attachment, that was an 80-pin connector. This incorporated both power and data into a single cable for those specific types of SCSI devices if they supported them. As I said, SCSI is a really old standard and is considered a legacy technology. Its maximum speed was only 320 megabits per second, which means it is 20 times slower than a modern SATA revision 3 cable. And this is why SCSI really doesn't have a place in today's modern environment, and everyone has pretty much moved over to using SATA or other types of connectors like USB and Thunderbolt for modern peripherals and storage devices.